6, 1968, 55 years ago, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated in California. He was running for president. He had just won the California primary. And the reason I bring this up, well, a couple of reasons. One, Kennedy was essentially your traditional liberal, but in 1968 he had started to move in directions that most of the Democrats hadn't. He had come out strongly against the war, although he had supported early on as his brother's attorney general. He talked about the kids all the time, meaning groups like SDS and civil rights activists. He was sympathetic to them. He went out to California and marched with Chavez and the farm workers. So it was a fairly progressive, campaign up to that point. And Kennedy was killed by Sirhan Sirhan, a Palestinian who the story went was upset at Kennedy's and the Democrats' basically unadulterated support of Israel. And so it's important to understand, like, there was this kind of transformation of Bobby Kennedy in 1968 into a more progressive candidate. And there are, some really moving stories about how people on the left, SDS, even Weather Underground people responded to his death. But the reason I bring it up also is because it's become kind of an issue again now that RFK Jr. is running for president. Now he's running for president essentially on he kind of became more famous recently because he's an anti-vaxxer. But since he started this campaign, he's also brought another conspiracy in. And this is something we talk about a lot, just kind of the left and conspiracy theory. And, Bobby Kennedy Jr. is now claiming that his uncle was killed by the CIA or the military industrial complex, the Oliver Stone line. And he's also claiming that his father was the victim of some kind of deep state conspiracy. And people on the left, a lot of people on the left are latching on to that. The crazies, in the Oliver Stone cracker factory are jumping all over it. And, once again, it's just, I think this is something we'll talk about in the future, coming up. These conspiracy theories don't do us any good. They kind of, give you this idea that there are these kind of good people operating and decisions, they're making good decisions, but then other people, these, malicious actors are imposing, things upon them, like assassinations of the Kennedys or something like that, in order to root out the people who want to change society. And that's just kind of silly. There's no one, JFK or anybody else, was going to reverse the Cold War in 1963. Bobby Kennedy wasn't going to somehow become a supporter, wasn't becoming a supporter of Palestinian rights in 1968. All of these people are agents of the ruling class. Politicians are, media are, intellectuals, most professors are, right? And they're kind of inbred in this system. And so what you have isn't, people who are going to try to change everything and kind of reverse the Cold War and the Vietnam War and the repression of Cuba, whatever, right? They're not doing that. Essentially, what we have are these kind of debates at a very high level between agents of the ruling class who basically see the world the same way. And the people who report on it aren't being, manipulated or conned into accepting the government's line, and portraying it. They're not agents of the deep state. That's just the system in which they operate. I mean, you and I, we're never going to work for the New York Times, not because we don't buy into any of these weird things. We're not going to do that. That's not our ideology. That's not our political culture, right?
Right.
And so it's not like you have to be brainwashed into. People who work for the New York Times aren't brainwashed into working for the different. They believe it. That's, Gramscian cultural hegemony. And I think that's something to understand when we talk about Bobby Kennedy, when we talk about conspiracies. These people believe in the system, right? Because that's the way they were indoctrinated. They're not hiding stuff and they're not covering stuff up in defense of the deep state. They don't think that way. To them, that's just natural, It's no conspiracy that the media is, pimping for the Ukraine war. That's the way they believe. That's who they are. And so I think we have to understand that and quit looking for these, like, every time something happens now, a lot of people are saying, okay, what was the CIA's role in this? Or what did the NSC do? And it's not that's the way the state works. And I think, if we'd accept that, it's actually, to me, far more radical. Remember after 9/11, immediately, a bunch of people said, oh, it's an inside job. Mossad did it. Bush and Cheney did it, blah, blah, blah. To me, it's far more radical and actually far more frightening to think that the United States has meddled in the Middle East for so long and with such, force and violence that a bunch of people were willing to kidnap, hijack planes and blow up buildings with them. I mean, that's to me far more radical than the idea that some bad actor, for God knows what reason, would stage this. And so that's just kind of my rant today. But Bobby Kennedy's assassination kind of provoked that, and his son's candidacy, which is getting surprising support from the left. Now, to some degree, I think that's just because Biden is old and pretty adult. But I think also people are really kind of building into this, and they see him as kind of a countercultural or a progressive figure because of these conspiracies he's spreading about, whether it be vaccines or his uncle's assassination or his dad's murder. And so avoid conspiracy. Just, Occam's razor, the most obvious explanation is usually the correct one.
Well, and then the other, I mean, also, RFK Jr. also plays into like other conspiracy theories too, which are a little bit more contemporary. He's an anti-vaxxer. He promotes a lot of misinformation around vaccines and masks and COVID and things along those lines. And so he is definitely. I always question whether people who are promoting these things are actually really bought in on them, or if they're just taking advantage of the opportunity. And so, he is definitely like an opportunist, where he's probably also he's definitely got a lot of supporters on the left, and there's like a pretty big anti-vaxxer movement on the left. I mean, I experience it a lot here in California. I'll be real, like this sort of new age hippie thing. But then, it's also, ironically, it's the way in which maybe people on the left are trying to build relations with people on the right with this anti-vaxxer, ridiculous garbage. So it's very disturbing. I'll say that in the least.
Yeah. I mean, it's unfortunate that there's not like a legit, what I would call legitimate person, attacking Biden or going at Biden from the left.
Or running, just even running.
Yeah. I mean, just to raise this up, because I mean, the fact is, right now in polling, I've seen Kennedy and
it's probably going to be Trump, actually, is who's going to run to the left.
Run from the left, yeah, on certain issues, yeah. The RFK and Marianne Williamson are polling combined at like what, 35 or 40?
Yeah. So, but I haven't seen a recent poll. The last poll I saw Biden was at 62%, which means they're running at like 38% combined.
Yeah. I mean, that, in the famous, I've said this before on talking to you on this, probably recently, the famous 1968 New Hampshire primary that, kind of convinces LBJ to drop out. And that's been misremembered too. Eugene McCarthy did not defeat Lyndon Johnson. He ran well. I think he got like 35 or 40%. And that was enough.
And just in New Hampshire.
In New Hampshire, right. But that was enough, for a sitting president to say, oh, I'm in trouble. And actually another adjunct of that, because a lot of these conspiracy theory people have said Bobby Kennedy was killed because he was going to win the nomination and pull the party to the left. Bobby Kennedy was not going to get the nomination. Just wasn't going to happen any more than Bernie Sanders was going to win it in 2016. All political parties, except for the Republicans in 2016, much to their, I guess, credit, I don't know what you say. The Republicans in 2016 ran the most democratic, small d democratic primary I've ever seen, because the party leaders at that point early on hated Trump and they were terrified of him, right? And Buddy won the nomination. The Democrats, on the other hand, always monkey wrenches. And in 1968, they were operating under old rules where most of the delegates were just chosen by state party leaders, by national delegates, by labor, various big Democratic constituencies would choose delegates. So the fact that RFK won the California primary didn't mean by any means he wasn't even close to becoming the nominee. He wasn't going to become the nominee. Hubert Humphrey was clearly going to be the Democratic nominee that year. So the idea that they had to assassinate him to prevent that is just like the JFK assassination. It's just, there's nothing there. There's no evidence for it. And that's the thing, as lefties, we can have our beliefs, but at some point we should back it up with like, something real, not be like Republicans or these right-wing kooks sending memes out, all the time about stuff that never happened. And when the left starts doing that, it's no better. It's no more noble.
Drinking Oliver Stone's Kool-Aid, if you will. Like, he doesn't touch on, in both JFK and a movie he made a few years later called Nixon with Anthony Hopkins, they not only lift up JFK conspiracy. Obviously, in JFK they do that. They also lift up the conspiracy around RFK. And actually, in one of them, at least, they also lift up a conspiracy around Martin Luther King, which is maybe the most credible of the three conspiracies.
That's worth looking into, probably, yeah, because that's bizarre. But no, well, Oliver Stone. I mean, look at how many lefties. We kind of joke about celebrities and failed comedians, but on the other hand, these people do have influence, and Oliver Stone, has driven. I mean, most Americans now believe that some form of JFK conspiracy theory. Look at how many leftists now are, pimping for atomic power, a show that we've just done, an interview we just did with Josh Frank, and Oliver Stone's all over that too. So these folks do have juice and they can influence us. And I'd say again, look beyond that and just do a little bit of research on your own.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's my history. That's my history lesson for, but and it's a shame, Bobby Kennedy. I think that there was a different politics brewing in 1968 with Martin Luther King, with Bobby Kennedy, with the farm workers, with the women's liberation movement. There was a lot going on.
Frank Church. I've actually been reading a biography of Frank Church, which actually was, he was so to the left of Johnson and the party that he boycotted the DNC in 68.
I know, if you look at liberals in 1968, they're way more left than like Bernie Sanders is today. And
Yeah.
there was a good core of probably a dozen or so who were, legit. Frank Church, even Republicans like Packwood and Javits were far to the left of today's Democrats.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
you had I grew up in Ohio where, no one would think John Glenn and Metzenbaum are radicals, but again, they were far more progressive than any Democrats today
And
would be.
Frank Church was like a liberal Democrat, far to the left of anyone who would call themselves a liberal Democrat today from Idaho.
Yeah. Well, you had a bunch of, those states, Montana, Idaho, Washington had, the old isolationist tradition was still, strong enough that these people had come out of that. Minnesota, the DFL. So you had a legitimate liberal left movement in the 60s. And I think 1968 was kind of the heyday of it. And since then, it's really, hit the skids, and the Republicans have been on this full scale slash and burn offensive. And the Democratic Party, for the most part, has said, okay, we're going to go along with you. We just won't be quite as bad as you, but we're going to go with you. We're going to trail. And,
Yep.
So everything's farther and further and further to the right.
Yep.
That's why it's well, to some degree laughable, but it also kind of makes me sick to my stomach to hear these Republicans attacking, the Democratic Socialist or the Marxist in the Democratic Party, right? It's terrifying.
The groomer Marxists.